The room went completely silent when my aunt looked at me and said, "You really think your master's degree makes you qualified to handle all of this? There's a doctor in the family now. Maybe you should let someone with a doctorate take charge." She said it calmly, almost politely, which somehow made it worse. My grandfather was sitting only a few feet away, exhausted from months of illness, while folders from the VA, Medicare paperwork, medication lists, and home health documents covered the coffee table between us. I remember staring at her for a few seconds, feeling the heat climb from my neck to my face. I had spent months fighting through phone calls, forms, appointments, insurance questions, and government bureaucracy just to make sure our grandfather received the care he was entitled to. She had walked into the situation with a title and an opinion, and apparently that was supposed to matter more than everything I had actually been doing. What she didn't know was that her obsession with the word doctor was about to become the reason I earned one of those titles myself. Before we get into how that happened, if you've ever had someone underestimate you because they thought their education, job, money, or family status made them better than you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me. Because this isn't really a story about getting a degree. It's about what happens when someone keeps trying to make you feel small until you finally decide that you are done asking for permission to be proud of yourself. And trust me, by the time this story reached its ending, my grandfather got to witness something that meant far more to me than any title ever could. My family situation was always a little unusual. My stepdad had a much larger age gap with his siblings, which meant that one of my aunts was actually around my age. Growing up, that created a strange dynamic between us. Technically, she was my aunt, but there wasn't some enormous generational distance separating us. We were close enough in age that comparisons were almost inevitable. And as we got older, those comparisons became more obvious. She was academically brilliant, incredibly ambitious, and eventually went on to earn a PhD in veterinary medicine. I genuinely mean it when I say I was proud of her. She worked hard for that degree, and I never believed that her success somehow took anything away from mine. My own path was different. I earned a Master of Social Work and MSW because at the time, that was exactly what I needed for the career I was pursuing. I wasn't chasing letters after my name just for the sake of collecting them. I had a lot happening in my life, and I was focused on building a career that allowed me to help people in practical ways. Social work wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't the kind of profession where people automatically assumed you were the smartest person in the room. A lot of the work happened quietly behind the scenes, helping people navigate systems that seemed designed to confuse them. But I loved it. I learned how to listen when people were overwhelmed. I learned how to find resources when families didn't know where to look. I learned how to deal with government agencies, healthcare systems, insurance companies, paperwork, eligibility requirements, and all the endless little barriers that could make someone's life harder when they were already struggling. I didn't have a PhD hanging on my wall, but I knew how to get things done. And then my grandfather got sick. He was a veteran, and when he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, everything changed. Suddenly, things that had once been ordinary became complicated. His health needs increased. Appointments multiplied. There were medications to keep track of, specialists to coordinate, services to request, forms to complete, and decisions that couldn't simply be postponed until someone felt ready to deal with them. MS didn't just affect his body. It created a maze of practical problems around him, and someone had to learn how to navigate that maze. I stepped in. Part of it was because I loved my grandfather. Part of it was because I knew I had the skills to help. And part of it was because I understood the systems involved. As a veteran myself, I already knew more than the average person about the VA. As a master's-level social worker, I understood how care coordination worked. I knew which questions to ask, which documents mattered, and how important it was to keep pushing when an agency gave you an answer that didn't make sense. So I started making calls. Then more calls. Then more calls after that. I learned the names of people I never expected to know. I kept records. I organized paperwork. I followed up when someone promised to call and didn't. I sat with my grandfather while we discussed his options. I helped coordinate home health services and worked through the complicated relationship between VA benefits, Medicare, and the other services available to him. None of it felt heroic. Most of it was frustrating, repetitive, and exhausting. But it mattered. There were days when I would sit at my grandfather's kitchen table surrounded by papers, staring at a form that seemed to have been written specifically to confuse ordinary human beings. I'd rub my eyes, take a breath, and remind myself that somewhere on the other side of that paperwork was a person who needed help. And that person was my grandfather. He noticed. That was one of the things I treasured most. He never treated my work like it was insignificant. He would watch me make another phone call or explain another complicated process and say something like, "I don't know how you keep track of all this." I'd laugh and tell him, "Someone has to," and he would smile. At that point, I wasn't thinking about my aunt. I wasn't thinking about degrees. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I was simply trying to help a man I loved maintain as much dignity and independence as possible while his health declined. Then, my aunt started getting involved. At first, I welcomed it. I assumed she wanted to help. After all, this was her father. If she had ideas, questions, or concerns, I was willing to listen. But it didn't take long for me to realize that she wasn't simply trying to help. She was questioning almost everything I did. Why was this service being arranged? Why had that appointment been scheduled? Who had made that decision? Why wasn't a doctor making these choices? And then came the comments about credentials. The first time she brought up her doctorate, I didn't think much of it. She mentioned that she had spent years studying and that she understood medical matters better than I did. Fair enough. She had specialized knowledge. I never disputed that. But eventually the conversation shifted from "I know something about this" to "I should be in charge because I'm a doctor." That distinction became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while we were discussing my grandfather's care, she looked at me with an expression that suggested she had already decided I was the problem. She argued that because she had a doctorate, her judgment should carry more weight. I tried explaining that my role wasn't to replace his doctors. I wasn't pretending to diagnose him or make medical decisions outside my expertise. My role was to coordinate services, navigate the VA and Medicare systems, advocate for him, and make sure his wishes were respected. But she didn't seem interested in the distinction. "You're not a doctor," she said. I remember those words because they were delivered like a verdict. I looked across the room at my grandfather. He was tired. His illness had already taken so much from him. The last thing he needed was for his family to turn his care into an academic competition. So I kept my voice calm. "I know I'm not a medical doctor. That's not what I'm doing." She shook her head. "I just think someone with a doctorate should be handling this." There it was again. The title, the letters, the status. It wasn't about whether my grandfather was receiving the right services anymore. It wasn't even about whether I was doing my job properly. Somehow, my education had become the battlefield. And the more she pushed, the more something inside me started changing. Because there is a particular kind of anger that doesn't arrive like an explosion. It builds slowly, quietly. It sits underneath your ribs while you continue doing what needs to be done. You keep your voice calm. You keep making the calls. You keep filling out the forms. You keep helping the person who needs you. But every time someone tells you that your work isn't enough, another little piece of patience disappears. I could have argued with her. I could have listed everything I had accomplished. I could have explained exactly how many hours I'd spent navigating the systems she was suddenly claiming authority over. Instead, I looked at her and realized something. Maybe she was right about one thing. Maybe I should get a doctorate. Not because I needed one to help my grandfather. Not because I needed to prove that my MSW was valuable. And certainly not because I cared about winning some ridiculous family competition. I wanted one because I was tired of hearing the word doctor used like it was a measure of human worth. So, half frustrated and half determined, I finally said the sentence that would change the direction of my life. "You know what? I'm getting my doctorate just to spite you." For a second, nobody said anything. I expected my aunt to laugh. Instead, my grandfather smiled. And that smile told me that something much bigger than revenge had just begun. I honestly thought the words would disappear the moment they left my mouth. "I'm getting my doctorate just to spite you." It was the kind of thing you say when you're frustrated, when your patience has been stretched too thin, when someone has spent so long making you feel inadequate that you finally say something you might not normally say. But my grandfather didn't laugh. He looked at me with that familiar spark in his eyes, the same expression he'd had whenever he knew I was about to do something difficult. Then he smiled and said, "Well, if you're going to do it, I'll be there to see you graduate." I laughed because the idea sounded almost ridiculous. My aunt had accidentally turned a family argument into a 5-year challenge, and my grandfather had just volunteered to be my biggest supporter. The strange thing was that once I said it out loud, I couldn't stop thinking about it. At first, I told myself it was just anger. I would cool down. I would realize that I didn't actually need another degree and move on with my life. But every time I remembered my aunt saying, "You're not a doctor," something inside me tightened. I didn't want to spend my life chasing approval from someone else. I didn't want to become obsessed with titles. Yet I also couldn't deny that her words had hit a nerve. I had worked hard for my MSW. I had built a career with it. I had spent years learning how to help people through some of the hardest moments of their lives. And somehow, because I didn't have the title she had, she treated everything I knew as though it were automatically less valuable. That was the part that bothered me most. It wasn't that she had a doctorate. I was genuinely happy for her. It was the way she used it. There is a huge difference between being proud of your accomplishments and using those accomplishments as a weapon against someone else. I could have celebrated her success without feeling threatened by it. I wanted the same courtesy in return. Instead, every conversation seemed to become another opportunity for her to remind me that she had reached a higher academic level. So I started researching doctoral programs. At first, I did it almost secretly. Late at night, after the rest of the house was quiet, I'd sit in front of my computer and look through program requirements. I compared universities, course structures, application deadlines, tuition costs, residency requirements, dissertation expectations, and everything else that came with pursuing a doctor of social work. The more I learned, the more serious it became. This wasn't some weekend certificate I could casually pick up. It was going to require years of work, sacrifice, discipline, and money. I knew there would be nights when I would question why I'd started. I knew I'd have to balance school with work and with everything happening in my family. And then there was my grandfather. His condition wasn't getting easier. If anything, caring for him made the idea of going back to school seem completely unreasonable. There were days when I was exhausted before the day even started. I'd wake up thinking about appointments, paperwork, deadlines, and whether he'd had a good night. I'd spend part of the day working and another part dealing with his care. Then, after everything was finished, I'd try to find the mental energy to study. Sometimes I'd sit in front of my laptop with a textbook open and realize I'd been staring at the same paragraph for 10 minutes. I'd close my eyes, take a breath, and hear my grandfather's voice in my head. "You said you were going to do it." That became my motivation. Not my aunt, not the title. Him. I applied to a doctoral program, and when I finally received the acceptance, I stared at the screen for a long time. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt nervous. There was no dramatic music playing in the background. No one was cheering. It was just me, sitting there with an acceptance message on a screen, realizing that I had voluntarily signed up for years of hard work. Then I told my grandfather. His reaction was priceless. He looked at me and said, "I knew you would." I asked him how he could possibly have known. He shrugged. "Because when you get mad, you work harder." That made me laugh. He was right. From that point forward, my doctorate became part of our lives. It wasn't something I pursued separately from caring for him. In a strange way, the two things became connected. My grandfather became the person I came home to after difficult classes. He became the person I talked to when I was frustrated. Sometimes he didn't understand the details of what I was studying, but he understood perseverance. He understood what it meant to keep going when your body and mind were telling you to stop. Meanwhile, my aunt didn't exactly disappear from the situation. If anything, the doctorate gave her another reason to make comments. The first time she heard I had enrolled, she gave me a look that I still remember. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't encouragement. It was almost amusement. "So, you're actually doing it?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled. "Well, good for you." The words sounded supportive, but her tone wasn't. I knew what she was thinking. She probably expected me to quit. Maybe she thought I had made an emotional decision and would eventually realize that a doctorate wasn't worth the effort. Maybe she thought I was trying to compete with her. Maybe she thought I was chasing her status. But I wasn't. I was chasing a promise. And there was something else happening underneath all of it. The more I studied, the more I realized that my aunt's obsession with titles had accidentally pushed me into a deeper understanding of my own profession. I began seeing social work differently. I started appreciating the research behind the systems I'd spent years navigating. I learned how policy, healthcare, psychology, economics, and human behavior intersected. I began asking questions I hadn't had time to explore when I was working full-time and simply trying to help people survive complicated situations. My anger was slowly becoming curiosity. My spite was becoming purpose. And that frightened me a little, because I started realizing that I might actually be doing this for myself. Still, I wasn't going to pretend the original motivation had disappeared. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I remembered that conversation. You're not a doctor. Whenever I had a paper due and wanted to sleep instead of writing, I remembered it. Someone with a doctorate should really be in charge. Whenever I doubted myself, I remembered the look on my aunt's face. And then I'd open my laptop again. There were nights when I worked until my eyes burned. There were weekends when everyone else seemed to be relaxing while I was buried in research. There were moments when I wondered if I had completely lost my mind. A doctorate isn't just about intelligence. It's about endurance. It's about being willing to do the same difficult thing again and again, even when nobody is watching. And through all of it, my grandfather kept asking one question. When's graduation? At first, I would tell him it was years away. He didn't care. He would ask again a few weeks later. When's graduation? I'd laugh. Grandpa, I don't know. It's a long way off. He'd nod as if that didn't matter. I'll be there. Those 3 words became incredibly important to me, because while I was pursuing a degree partly to prove a point to someone who had made me feel small, my grandfather had already given me something far more valuable. He believed in me before I had earned anything new. He didn't need to see a doctorate on my wall to respect me. He didn't need letters after my name to understand my worth. He simply knew who I was. And as his health continued to decline, that became more important than ever. There were days when I had to put my schoolwork aside because he needed me. There were days when I had to rearrange plans, miss something, or stay up late because his care came first. I sometimes worried that I wouldn't be able to finish the program. The thought terrified me because I had started imagining my grandfather sitting in the audience at graduation. What if he wasn't there? I refused to let myself finish that thought. Instead, I kept moving. Meanwhile, my aunt continued to insist that being a doctor meant she understood the situation better than everyone else. The irony was that I wasn't trying to take her place. I didn't want to be the medical expert. I wanted to make sure my grandfather's wishes were respected and that he received every service available to him. But family arguments have a way of turning complicated situations into competitions. And suddenly, we weren't just discussing healthcare anymore. We were discussing who knew more, who was more qualified, who deserved to be listened to. And without realizing it, my aunt had created exactly the environment where I was going to become the person she kept insisting I wasn't. The hardest part was watching my grandfather get caught in the middle. He didn't want his children fighting. He didn't want arguments around his medical care. He wanted peace. One evening, after another tense discussion, I sat beside him in his room. The house was quiet. A television played softly in the background, but neither of us was really watching it. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional sound of a car passing outside. My grandfather looked at me. You okay? I nodded. He knew I was lying. You don't have to prove anything to anybody, he said. I looked down at my hands. I know. No, you don't. I looked back at him. He smiled gently. You're working yourself into the ground because somebody made you feel like you weren't enough. His words hit harder than anything my aunt had ever said. Because he was right. I had started the doctorate to spite her. But somewhere along the way, I had started carrying her opinion around with me. And I didn't want to. I told him I was going to finish anyway. He nodded. Good. Then he paused. And when you graduate, don't look for her in the audience. I smiled. Who should I look for? He pointed at himself. Me. That moment stayed with me. It changed the entire meaning of the journey. I stopped thinking about what my aunt would say when I graduated. I stopped imagining her reaction. I stopped wondering whether she'd be impressed. I started imagining my grandfather sitting there. That became the finish line. And from that day forward, every assignment, every research paper, every late night, every difficult exam, every moment of exhaustion had one purpose. I was going to finish. Not because my aunt said I couldn't. Not because I needed her approval. But because the man who had always believed in me deserved to see me cross that stage. And as the years moved forward, something unexpected happened. The person who had started this journey out of spite was becoming someone who genuinely loved the work. The revenge was still there, but it was changing. I was no longer trying to become a doctor just to silence my aunt. I was becoming someone my younger self would have been proud to meet. And my grandfather was still there, asking the same question every few weeks. When's graduation? I would smile and answer him. Soon. Neither of us knew just how important that word was about to become. The first year of my doctoral program was harder than I had expected. I had gone into it thinking that determination would be enough, but determination doesn't magically create more hours in a day. I still had work. I still had responsibilities. My grandfather still needed help. And now, on top of everything else, I had readings, research papers, discussions, deadlines, and assignments that seemed to appear faster than I could finish them. Some nights I would sit at my desk long after midnight, surrounded by notes and half-empty cups of coffee, wondering why I had voluntarily done this to myself. Then I would remember my grandfather sitting in his chair, looking at me with complete confidence, and somehow I would open the laptop again. The biggest challenge wasn't the coursework itself. It was trying to balance school with the reality of watching someone you love become more dependent on you. MS is unpredictable, and there were good days followed by difficult ones without warning. Some mornings my grandfather would seem almost like himself, joking with me and complaining about the weather. Other days, even simple things required assistance. I became increasingly familiar with the rhythms of his care, the appointments, the paperwork, the phone calls, the questions that needed answers, and the quiet moments when there was nothing I could do except sit beside him. Those moments taught me something my textbooks never could. Sometimes helping someone isn't about fixing the problem. Sometimes it's simply about refusing to leave them alone while they're facing it. My aunt continued to have opinions. Every family gathering seemed to carry the possibility of another argument. She would ask questions about my grandfather's care, and when I explained what was happening, she'd sometimes challenge the decisions, as though I were trying to run a hospital instead of coordinating services. Whenever she disagreed with me, the conversation eventually circled back to her credentials. She didn't always say the words directly anymore, but the implication was obvious. She was the doctor. I was the social worker. Therefore, she believed her opinion should automatically carry more weight. One afternoon, she challenged me about a service I had arranged for our grandfather. I explained why it was appropriate, what the eligibility requirements were, and how it fit into the larger care plan. She listened with her arms crossed, then gave me a look that immediately told me she wasn't convinced. She said that while she appreciated my effort, she still believed medical decisions should be guided by someone with a doctorate. I reminded her that I wasn't making medical diagnoses. I was coordinating resources and advocating for our grandfather. She responded that I was getting defensive. I remember thinking that it was strange how quickly people call you defensive when you refuse to accept their disrespect quietly. I didn't argue. I had learned that arguing with someone determined to misunderstand you is exhausting and rarely productive. Instead, I calmly explained the facts, documented what needed to be documented, and continued doing what my grandfather had asked me to do. That became my strategy. I stopped trying to win family arguments and started focusing on results. If my grandfather received the service he needed, that mattered more than whether my aunt admitted I had been right. Still, her comments stayed with me longer than I wanted them to. There were nights when I would finish a difficult assignment and wonder what she would say if she knew how hard the program really was. Then I would get annoyed with myself for caring. Why was I still allowing someone else's opinion to occupy space in my head? I had started this journey to prove a point, but now the only person I really needed to prove anything to was myself. My grandfather noticed the change in me. One evening, after I'd spent hours working on a research project, he asked why I looked so tired. I told him I was fine. He laughed and said I had been saying that since I was a teenager. Then he asked whether I was still determined to finish the doctorate. I told him yes. He smiled and said, "Good. Just remember, the degree is something you earn. It isn't something that makes you valuable." I knew he was right, but hearing it from him made the words sink deeper. My grandfather had never cared about titles. He cared about character. He cared about whether someone kept their word. He cared about whether you showed up when people needed you. That was exactly what he had done for me throughout my life, and now I wanted to do the same for him. As the second year approached, the workload became more demanding. The novelty had disappeared. I wasn't excited about every class anymore. Sometimes I was simply tired. There were deadlines stacked on top of one another, and I had moments when quitting seemed like the most sensible decision. One night, after an especially difficult week, I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for several minutes. I thought about how much easier my life would be if I walked away. Nobody would blame me. I had already earned a master's degree. I had a career. I had responsibilities. There was no practical reason I had to keep going. Then I heard my grandfather coughing from the other room. I got up and checked on him. He looked exhausted, but when he saw me, he smiled. I adjusted his blanket, made sure he had what he needed, and sat there for a while. He asked how school was going. I told him it was difficult. He nodded as if I had just confirmed something obvious. Then he said, "Difficult doesn't mean impossible." I laughed quietly because it sounded exactly like something he would say. I told him I was considering taking a break. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Take a break if you need one. Just don't confuse resting with quitting." That sentence stayed with me. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started again. By the time I reached the dissertation stage, the entire experience had changed me. The angry person who had announced she was getting a doctorate just to spite her aunt was almost gone. I still remembered why I'd started, but the degree now represented something much bigger. It represented endurance. It represented the years I had spent learning, working, caring, and refusing to give up. It represented every night when I could have walked away, but didn't. And then there was my grandfather's health. His condition continued to decline, and suddenly the finish line didn't feel theoretical anymore. I became painfully aware that time was moving faster than I wanted it to. Every time he asked about graduation, I heard something different in his question. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a promise we were both trying to hold on to. I started keeping track of my progress differently. Instead of thinking, "I still have so much left," I began thinking, "I'm one step closer. One chapter completed. One requirement finished. One research milestone passed. One more piece of the dissertation done." I broke the enormous task into smaller pieces because that was the only way I could keep moving without becoming overwhelmed. My aunt, meanwhile, seemed less interested in my progress than she had been at the beginning. Maybe she had finally realized I wasn't going to quit. Maybe she had assumed the degree would eventually become irrelevant. I didn't know. What I did know was that I had stopped looking for her reaction. If she congratulated me, fine. If she didn't, that was fine too. The real audience for my graduation had already been decided. My grandfather. There were moments when I wondered whether he would actually make it there. I tried not to think about it, but the thought was always somewhere in the back of my mind. Every appointment, every difficult day, every change in his condition reminded me that life doesn't guarantee us the endings we want. I wanted him in that audience more than I wanted the degree itself. One evening, I sat beside him and told him that I was getting close. He looked at me and smiled. I told him I was nervous about finishing. He reached over and squeezed my hand. His grip wasn't as strong as it used to be, but I felt it. Then he said, "You've already finished the hardest part." I asked him what he meant. He said, "You kept going." I didn't know what to say after that. So I just sat there. For all the arguments, all the insults, all the comparisons, all the nights I had spent wondering whether I was good enough, my grandfather had reduced the entire journey to 2 words. You kept going. And suddenly, my aunt's opinion felt smaller than it ever had before. I realized something important. Revenge doesn't always look like destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes revenge is simply becoming so secure in yourself that their opinion no longer controls your emotions. Sometimes the best response to someone who constantly tells you that you're not enough is to quietly become everything they said you couldn't be, without ever needing to announce it. Still, there was one final moment I wanted. I wanted to walk across that stage. I wanted to look into the audience. And I wanted to see my grandfather there. So I kept going. The final months were brutal. My dissertation demanded everything I had left. There were revisions, corrections, feedback, more revisions, and moments when I wondered whether the finish line was moving farther away every time I got close. I learned to stop celebrating too early. Every completed section revealed another task waiting behind it. But eventually, there came a day when I submitted the final version. I stared at the screen after clicking the button. For several seconds, I didn't move. Then I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. It was done. I had earned the degree that my aunt had unintentionally challenged me to pursue. But I wasn't thinking about her. I was thinking about my grandfather. I went to tell him, and when I walked into the room, he looked at my face and immediately knew something had happened. I told him that I had finished. He smiled, and for a moment, he looked almost like the man I remembered from years earlier. Then he said, "I told you I'd be there." I smiled back. "Yeah," I said. "You did." What neither of us knew was that the graduation ceremony would become one of the most emotional days of my entire life. I had spent years imagining that moment, but reality had a way of making it more powerful than anything I could have pictured. And somewhere in that audience, if my aunt decided to come, she would finally have to watch the person she had once dismissed as not a doctor walk across the stage wearing the title she had treated like a measure of superiority. But that wasn't going to be the most important part. Not even close. Because when the ceremony finally arrived, I wasn't looking for her. I was looking for him. The morning of my graduation didn't feel real. After years of assignments, research, deadlines, exhaustion, and moments when I wondered whether I had made a terrible mistake, the day had finally arrived. I woke up earlier than I needed to, stared at my graduation clothes hanging nearby, and just stood there for a while. I kept thinking about how strange the journey had been. It had started with one angry sentence directed at my aunt, but somehow it had turned into years of personal growth, professional development, and memories with my grandfather that I would carry for the rest of my life. My grandfather was still dealing with everything his illness had taken from him, but he had insisted on being there. We had planned everything carefully because I knew the day could be physically demanding for him. I wasn't sure whether he would have the energy to stay for the entire ceremony, but he refused to discuss the possibility of missing it. When I reminded him that he didn't have to push himself, he gave me that familiar look and said he had been waiting too long to see me graduate. There was no argument after that. I simply nodded and promised him I would make sure he was comfortable. When I arrived at the ceremony, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and fear. There were graduates everywhere, families taking photographs, people adjusting caps and gowns, and friends laughing nervously while waiting for everything to begin. I looked around the crowd, but I wasn't searching for my aunt. I was searching for one person. When I finally saw my grandfather, my chest tightened. He was there. He had made it. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The noise around me seemed to fade, and I could only see him sitting there. He looked tired, but he was smiling. I smiled back, and I swear that one moment was worth every late night I had spent staring at a computer screen. I didn't care about the degree anymore. I didn't care about proving anything. I just wanted him to know that we had made it to this day together. As the ceremony began, I tried to listen, but my mind kept wandering through the years behind me. I remembered the first conversation with my aunt. I remembered her telling me that someone with a doctorate should be in charge. I remembered how small those words had made me feel. Then I remembered my grandfather telling me that I didn't have to prove anything to anybody. Somewhere between those two moments, I had changed. I had started this journey because I was angry, but I was finishing it because I had discovered that I was capable of far more than I had believed. Then they started calling names. One by one, graduates walked across the stage. Each name brought another round of applause. I could feel my heart beating faster as the list got closer to mine. I kept looking toward the audience, and every time I saw my grandfather, I felt calmer. Finally, my name was announced. For a second, I froze. Then I stood. I walked toward the stage, hearing applause around me, but the only thing I could think about was the promise I had made years earlier. I crossed that stage and accepted my doctorate. The moment itself lasted only seconds, but emotionally it felt enormous. I looked out into the audience, and my eyes immediately found my grandfather. He was smiling. I smiled back. That was it. That was the revenge. Not the degree. Not my aunt. Not the title. The revenge was that someone had tried to convince me that my accomplishments weren't enough, and instead of allowing that belief to consume me, I had built something even greater while continuing to care for the person who mattered most. After the ceremony, my grandfather was one of the first people I hugged. He squeezed me as tightly as he could and told me he was proud of me. I tried to keep my emotions under control, but I couldn't. I had imagined hearing those words for years, and now they were actually happening. I told him that none of it would have happened without him. He shook his head and said, "You did the work." I remember looking down at my doctoral hood and thinking about how different it felt from what I had imagined years earlier. I had originally wanted the title because my aunt had used it to make me feel inferior. Now that I had it, I realized it had nothing to do with superiority. It was simply proof that I had completed something difficult. My aunt was there too. I didn't know whether she would attend, and honestly, I hadn't cared enough to ask. But eventually I saw her standing among the family members. She approached me after the ceremony, and for the first time in years, I noticed something different in her expression. There was no smugness, no lecture, no reminder about credentials. She looked at my doctoral hood, and then at me. "Congratulations," she said. I thanked her. That could have been the end of it. But then she added something about how she always knew I was capable of doing it. I almost laughed. Not because I wanted to embarrass her, but because I remembered every conversation we had ever had about my education. I remembered the way she had implied that my master's degree wasn't enough. I remembered the way she had insisted that someone with a doctorate should take over. And now she was standing in front of me, acting as though she had always been supportive. I could have reminded her. I could have listed every insult. I could have told her exactly how much her words had affected me. Instead, I simply smiled and said, "Thank you," because I finally understood that I didn't need the confrontation anymore. She had lost the power she once had over me. That was worth more than any argument. The rest of the day was spent celebrating with family, taking pictures, and trying to process the fact that I had actually finished. My grandfather kept looking at me with an expression that made me emotional every time I noticed it. He was proud, but there was something else in his expression too. Relief. Happiness. Maybe even a little disbelief that the stubborn promise we had made together had actually come true. Later, when things had become quieter, I sat beside him and we talked about the journey. I admitted that I had originally started the doctorate because I was angry at my aunt. He laughed and said he had known that from the beginning. I asked him why he had supported me if he knew my motivation wasn't exactly noble. He looked at me and said, "Because I knew you'd find your own reason to finish." That sentence stayed with me. He was right. My aunt had been the spark, but she wasn't the reason I finished. My grandfather was. And somewhere along the way, I became the reason too. The months after graduation were emotional in ways I hadn't expected. Having finally achieved the goal I'd spent years working toward should have felt like the beginning of something, but instead it made me painfully aware of how much time had passed. My grandfather's health continued to decline, and I knew our time together was becoming limited. I continued helping with his care, just as I had before. The doctorate didn't suddenly make me more important than anyone else. It didn't make me better at loving him. It didn't change the fact that sometimes the most valuable thing I could do was sit beside him and listen. There were days when we talked about ordinary things. There were days when we talked about the past. And there were days when neither of us said much at all. I learned not to underestimate those quiet moments. When someone you love is facing the end of their life, silence can become its own language. My grandfather sometimes joked about my title. He would introduce me to someone and make a point of saying, "This is my granddaughter. She's a doctor now." Then he'd grin at me as if he had personally earned the degree too. I would tell him, "You know I'm not that kind of doctor." He'd laugh and say, "I don't care. Doctor is doctor." We both knew he was joking, but those moments meant everything to me. Eventually, the family dynamics became calmer. My aunt and I didn't suddenly become best friends, and I don't want to pretend there was some perfect reconciliation that magically erased years of tension.
We simply stopped fighting about it.
Maybe she realized that I wasn't interested in competing anymore. Maybe I realized that I didn't need her approval. Either way, the conflict lost its power. And that was the strangest part of all. I had spent so much time imagining the moment when I would finally prove her wrong. But when that moment arrived, I barely cared about her reaction. I cared about my grandfather. I cared about the fact that he had seen me walk across that stage. I cared about the fact that he had kept his promise to be there. And I cared about the fact that I had kept mine. Then came the part of the story that made the entire journey mean something different. My grandfather's condition reached a point where his care became increasingly focused on comfort and support. The person who had once been the one encouraging me to keep going now needed me to be the strong one. I helped where I could, made calls, coordinated services, and tried to make sure he was surrounded by people who loved him. There was no dramatic movie scene. No perfect final speech. Real life rarely works that way. There were quiet days. There were difficult days. There were moments when I wished I could trade places with him. But through all of it, I was grateful. Because he had seen me graduate. He had seen me earn the title that had once been used as a weapon against me. More importantly, he had seen me become the person I wanted to be. And when I thought back to that original argument with my aunt, I realized something that I hadn't understood then. She thought a doctorate would prove who was more qualified. My grandfather taught me that the real measure of a person isn't the letters after their name. It's what they do with the knowledge, the opportunities, and the time they're given. I had earned my doctorate, but my greatest achievement wasn't the title. It was being there for him. It was helping him navigate a system that could have overwhelmed him. It was sitting beside him when he was afraid. It was making sure his wishes mattered. And most importantly, it was having him there when I finally crossed that stage. My aunt may have started the argument, but she didn't get the final word. My grandfather did. And his final message to me was never about being better than anyone else. It was simply to keep going. So I did. Looking back now, I sometimes laugh at how this entire journey began. One argument. One comment about who is qualified enough. One person using the word doctor as though it automatically made her more valuable than everyone else in the room. And one frustrated sentence from me that I never expected to become a life-changing promise. "I'm getting my doctorate just to spite you." At the time, I thought I was declaring war in the pettiest way possible. I thought the ultimate revenge would be earning those 3 letters and watching my aunt realize that she could no longer use her doctorate to make me feel inferior. But by the time I finally earned my DSW, I understood that the real victory had nothing to do with her. The degree was difficult. There were years of sacrifice behind it, years of late nights, difficult assignments, research, deadlines, professional responsibilities, and moments when I seriously questioned whether I could keep going. There were days when I was exhausted before I even opened my laptop. There were nights when I wanted nothing more than to shut everything down and sleep. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered my grandfather. He was dealing with a disease that had taken away pieces of his independence, yet he never stopped encouraging me. Even when he was struggling himself, he would ask how school was going. Even when he was tired, he wanted to know when graduation was. He never doubted that I would make it. And then I did. I walked across that stage, with my grandfather watching me. That is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life. Not the diploma. Not the title. Not my aunt's expression. Not the applause. It was seeing him in that audience, and knowing that he had kept his promise. He had told me years earlier that he would be there, and despite everything his illness had put him through, he showed up. When I looked at him, I didn't see the argument that started my doctorate. I saw every phone call, every appointment, every difficult day, every conversation, every moment we had shared during the years leading up to that day. My aunt's reaction eventually became almost irrelevant. She had once believed that having a doctorate gave her automatic authority over me, and now I had earned my own doctorate. But instead of feeling victorious over her, I felt strangely peaceful. I didn't need to tell her she was wrong. I didn't need to remind her of the things she'd said. I didn't need to rub my achievement in her face. The fact that I had completed it was enough. The funny thing about proving someone wrong is that sometimes the most satisfying part is realizing you don't actually care whether they admit it. For years, I had thought revenge meant making someone regret hurting you. But my experience taught me that sometimes the best revenge is refusing to let their behavior determine who you become. My aunt's words could have made me bitter. They could have made me obsessed with competing with her. Instead, they pushed me into a journey that eventually became my own. I entered that doctoral program because I was angry, but I left it with more confidence, more knowledge, and a much deeper understanding of why I had chosen social work in the first place. And there was another lesson I carried with me. Education isn't supposed to be a hierarchy of human worth. A doctorate doesn't make someone a better person than someone with a master's degree, a bachelor's degree, or no degree at all. A title can tell you something about what a person studied, but it doesn't tell you how they treat people.